I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Well, hello again for another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes. This time we are blessed to have on Sean Domencic, formerly of the Tradistae podcast and Holy Family Catholic worker in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and currently an associate writer at New Polity, and a Catholic worker, a sinner, a saint. Anything you would add to that?
I think that's about a husband and a father, which I'm very blessed to be.
A recent father.
Yes. We actually just celebrated our son's first birthday. I was raised in near here. I'm in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and raised in a small town around here, raised Catholic. So I don't have a dramatic conversion story into the faith. Though I did have, a significant sort of moral conversion, in deepening my faith, beginning in high school, and especially going to college. I encountered a dear friend, James, who was the co-founder of Tradistae, and he introduced me to Catholic social teaching, and that was kind of a cascading effect on my life, and led me to start writing, reading, learning about this church's social teaching. And when wanting to live that out and figure out what that would entail, I met some friends in the Catholic worker movement, because I kept running into the name of Dorothy Day and Peter Marin, who you may be familiar with here at the Marin Academy. And then from there, my wife and I, we were engaged and really interested in intentional community, which was a kind of obviously related topic in all of these discussions. And then from that, we sort of found everything coalescing and starting the Catholic worker community, because we wanted the intentional community, we wanted the living out of the social teaching and all this stuff. So we started Holy Family Catholic Worker, which my wife and I, right as we got married, we moved into that new community with a longtime Catholic worker friend, Elliot. And from there, we ran that community for 2 years and actually dissolved it just this last fall. And so now we're kind of in between, and he's still involved. There's another Catholic worker here in Lancaster that we're involved with. We've got a roundtable coming up on Sunday. But yeah, so just kind of figuring out what Catholic worker life as a married couple with children looks like, and discerning that. And obviously, I've run Tradistae for some time. I've gotten involved with New Polity, which is sort of in many ways the same kind of ideas in a lot of ways as Tradistae, not explicitly a Catholic worker background, but kind of joined forces with them, and really love what they're doing. So, yeah.
Okay. And real quick, could you talk about kind of the impetus behind why you started Tradistae?
Yeah, at the time it was, James and I were on Twitter, unfortunately, too much, but looking around and seeing, all this, seeing the sort of scene of, traditional Catholicism and Catholic social teaching, sort of Catholic radicalism being batted around. And there was some other things going on at the same time, stuff like, the whole integralism conversation, the Josias, the Tradistas, who we were just a tiny bit behind, and we were kind of following them as it happened, and noticing a lack of a sort of committed Catholicism that was orthodox and really emphasized that element, and also radical, because there's plenty of sort of communist Catholics or whatever, but who weren't necessarily Orthodox, and then there's plenty of Orthodox Catholics, and even the integralist types who were believed in Catholic social teaching, but definitely had a very sort of reactionary or right-wing inflected understanding of that. And so what we were really interested in is that synthesis of orthodoxy and radicalism, and didn't feel that was anywhere. And the particular impetus was when I was at a homeschool family, a traditionalist kind of homeschool family, and was looking at some of their textbooks that taught history and political philosophy and stuff, and noted how it was essentially it imported, even though it had like the sort of reactionary flavor of Christ the King politics, it also was perfectly comfortable kind of using the names of the founding fathers, and trying to make some kind of synthesis with American conservatism, and being sort of shocked, that even and I myself wasn't raised a traditionalist. I was like kind of hoping, the traditionalists will have this right. I was sort of a naive young trad at that point. And that was a real an inspiration to say, oh wow, like, even they're not presenting the social teaching as it is given by the church. And so, who is? So goal to sort of make easy essays of some of the key concepts in the style of Peter Mara that are in the encyclicals, and start putting that out there. So since then, a lot has happened. New Polity was founded a couple of years after that, and like I said, I've sort of joined forces with them. And there's been other Catholic worker endeavors, podcasts, websites. I mean, your own is in that vein, and there's the Coffee with Catholic Workers that started, but at the time, there really just was not much that I saw in terms of Catholic worker, an active Catholic worker website podcast that was presenting these sorts of ideas.
Mm-hmm. Before we move on, I'm curious, like, first of all, do you think that there's kind of an upswelling amongst, say, maybe particularly young people for traditionalism of some kind, and if so, why? I figure you're tapping into that, and it does seem like there's a bit more interest than usual. So in your estimation, what's going on with that?
Yeah. Well, I will say that, first of all, I should clarify that while I would have, maybe 4 years ago called myself a traditionalist, I don't now. And that's in part due to just, a deeper learning more about kind of the churches, learning more about Vatican II and the council, and seeing all of the ways that, traditionalism has become this kind of, the label or faction that's opposed to Vatican II. So it isn't something that I would, frame myself in terms of being a traditionalist, anymore. But at the same time, I that's something that I say with sorrow in a lot of ways, because I think my and others' hopes, was a traditionalism that wasn't just reactionary, a traditionalism that was really using, really, if your listeners are familiar with ressourcement theology, right? The idea of returning to the sources, that sort of the idea of tradition in that way of returning to these rich sources in a way to answer modern questions and such. And so I've been richly nourished by both the old rite, the traditional Latin Mass, as well as lots of just, discovering for the first time, and that I didn't have in my raising, discovering the encyclicals, just discovering so many of the lives of the saints, just traditions of the church that were not in practice, were not being lived out in my own parish growing up. And so I think for many people who in our sort of, suburban, technocratic, postmodern American way of life, that first discovery of tradition can seem like, oh, I found the answer. I found all the things that I didn't have in my consumerist, post-industrial wasteland of an anti-culture. But then I think for myself and for many others, one also has to recognize that you can't just sort of take tradition and import it and have an alternative ready-made. It has to be something that's living and alive, and that's where this traditionalism can easily kind of trap itself in thinking that one has all the answer if you just reject the new and go to the old, and you have to rather have the old in a new way, and you have to have there's that famous Peter Marin essay, which is to take a philosophy so old that it looks like new. And there needs to be that openness to the world to really engage between the sources, the ressourcement and the aggiornamento, the returning to the sources and the opening up and penetrating the world with this. So, but yeah, I think the attraction there is just that we have an anti-culture. We don't have a real sort of heritage, or a real sort of life, whether that's a religious life in the church or even just a community life, in our own families, our own towns, our own places. And so there's a yearning to get that, because those things nourish us as humans. They're sort of natural to what we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, and isn't this why I don't remember if it was a year ago, maybe two, you, along with Barnes from New Polity and Larry Chapp, wrote that a manifesto of the new traditionalism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that expresses a lot of those points of just, the idea of the new traditionalism, right? The verse that we put from Scripture at the beginning of that is, the kingdom of God is like a householder who from out of his treasures brings out of his his storehouse brings out treasures new and old, and that's kind of the the church's synthesis between reform and tradition, is that the church is always bringing out the old and presenting that to us, and always bringing out new ways that the Spirit is moving and expressing itself. And so those things are meant to go hand in hand. And in that, manifesto, it kind of goes through different points, and how that applies to politics, how it applies to theology, how it applies to liturgy. And mostly I'd hold everything in there. I'd say that probably since I've written that, I've, in certain discouraging experiences I've had with the traditionalist world and everything, would maybe, have increased my skepticism for the hope of the old rites, the traditional Latin Mass being, something that could contribute to liturgical development. But that's probably another conversation.
Yeah, maybe, but we're also about sort of delving into the discouraging things that are kind of like holding back progress that we think should happen. Mm-hmm. So I guess here's a question adjacent to that. For the same reason you're discouraged with kind of working with trads, if in fact that's what you're saying, is there a similar overlap to the reactionary liturgical commitments to not being open to Catholic workerhood or like truly progressive politics?
Yeah. Well, no, I think that's part of it, in that, what was Pope Benedict XVI's hope on the liturgy point, right, is that, in opening up the liturgy, he had that phrase about the mutual enrichment of rights, right? He wanted a recognition that this old thing was not bad. What was once holy is still holy, right? But he didn't want, a stagnation, right? Like a sense of like, this is, we want to, get everyone back to this or something, or read everything in the light of this old thing. And I think similarly with politics, so rather, well, maybe to make the point more clearly, with the liturgy, the hope of, my hope and the hope of others, and I think in many ways the hope of Benedict XVI was that the old rites and the new rites, right, would be something that would mutually inform one another, and we would recognize a path forward, that was ultimately drawing from both of these things. The opening up of the reform and the different ideas that were behind that, but also the recognition that there was good things in the old. And same with our politics in many ways, that a lot of traditionalists aren't they're not just conservative liberals or something. A lot of them are reactionaries in some way. They believe in Christ the King. They want to go back to the Middle Ages. They want to roll back the Enlightenment. The anti-Enlightenment politics is really key to most traditionalist thought, of saying, oh, everything went wrong with the Reformation. Everything went wrong with the French Revolution. And then you look at how someone like Ratzinger, who to many trads is a hero, you look at how he looks at the Enlightenment or the Reformation, and you find this incredibly nuanced view where he's saying, yes, all of these confusions and errors happened here, but, what were the points of reform that did need to happen here, that we need to embrace and take up in the church? Those ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, right? In what ways was the church not fully recognizing her own message on those points? And does she then need to take them up? In the Reformation, in what ways does the priesthood of all believers, the universal call to holiness, was that being expressed in the Reform movement, the Reformed churches, that the church then needed to take up? And that's in many ways what Vatican II did on both the political, the theological, the liturgical, on all those points. Obviously in line with the traditions of the church, maintaining that, those sources of the revealed truth that's handed down to us in part through sacred tradition, but at the same time being open to these points of reform. And I think in many ways the key error of traditionalism is that there's this hope, there's this belief that history doesn't exist, that you can contain God, you can contain the spirit of truth in a particular historical moment or form, whether that's a particular liturgy, it's Christendom, it's a particular moment in time, when in fact history, time is part of God's creation, and we have to be moving within that. We have to be moving within time to actually be in touch with God's work in the world.
I think this is the huge puzzle of how to communicate what you just said to ordinary people so that they can actually, fathom exactly. Because I think it's just part of the problem is it's just more attractive to simplify. Mm-hmm. What you said is things are complicated, and we need to take the time to understand the complications and the nuances and actually read what the popes say and things like this. And I think people really resist that. I mean, in your work in Tradistae, what have you found actually works? Are the simple, are the easy essays the ticket, or like how do you communicate that?
Yeah. I think definitely the easy essay model is part of it. I think one unfortunate thing in our day is that we're so drowned in mass media and just a deluge of clickbaiting articles that, the angry, flashy headlines rise to the top. And so I think in some ways to understand, yes, there needs to be for writers or for thinkers, there needs to be a willingness to communicate to the common man, in a simple way, because a lot of the great thinkers out there. DC Schindler, he's involved with New Polity. He's a great writer. Love his stuff. I've been deeply enriched by it. It is not high school reading level. It is something that unless you have some kind of like philosophical education, you're going to be thoroughly lost in. And that's not to say it's DC Schindler's job to, write more simply, but I think that for those of us who are who are really seeking the truth, there needs to be a willingness to, find, I think for people trying to teach these ideas, to simplify them, or maybe not even to simplify them, but just to get at their essence, their core, and express them. And then, of course, for those who are looking for a deeper understanding, they can read those more academic publications. But I think maybe even aside from like the techniques of the rhetoric, I think that there's also some just moral conversion involved for everyone, because for most people, it's attractive to be on social media, to be, to have the arguments, to be sort of taken up by the loud, flashy disagreements, trying to sort of jockey for success, likes and retweets and such. And I think that does a real number on our ability to seek the truth. And so I think that just a willingness to withdraw from that sort of constant debate and to live out a life of holiness, right? Because it's not going to be, these aren't just ideas to be debated for their own sake, right? Like they have real calls to our lives, real implications for how we ought to live. And so I think that moral conversion in many ways is the only answer to how do we communicate these things, because it's not like there's any one technique that'll do it. What'll ultimately do it is a witness of holiness, of sanctity. And if we were all saints, and living out the vocation as we were supposed to be, then we would be able to communicate that in the way that we should, and there would be a real sort of call rather than just an intellectual, debate. And then I'd kind of like to take us to talking about the Catholic worker movement. Sure, yeah. How do you view the state of the movement, and is it a site? And my hope is that it's a site of more of that moral rebirth. Yeah, that to kind of help create a new society in the shell of the old. Mm-hmm. That would be my hope. But what would you say about how things stand? Yeah, I think the movement's very messy, and there's largely a, Dorothy, when she was alive, it was always messy. Even when Dorothy was alive, there was a lot of different, even between Dorothy Day and Eamon Hennessy, they were friends, but Eamon Hennessy basically had it out for the hierarchy. And Dorothy, always was sort of gently, tolerating that, but chiding him or sort of, voicing her disagreement, or, her saying like, I don't necessarily agree with all that Eamon's saying about the hierarchy and such. So I think that remains an issue in the movement. And I think especially there's not really much in the way of clear, like, leaders of the movement. And so I think you do see maybe a drawing apart of those Catholic workers who are essentially sort of like spiritual leftists. And I don't say that disparagingly, but just more to recognize like their politics, their morality, everything comes from like the radical left. And they believe very much in spiritual, politics. Like they're not, that what makes them different than their Marxist confreres is that they believe in God, they believe in the Spirit, and their faith is very sincere, but it's not doctrinal. Like they don't believe, many of them, in the divinity of Christ or something like that, which is obviously extremely important to Dorothy. She look at her 1940 Aims and Means, which is a great document that I point people to, and to me, the closest thing that she wrote to a sort of a rule of the movement or something that kind of defines the essence of it. And she talks about the need to preach the faith, to preach Christ and Christ crucified. And if we've lost that, then we've lost our foundation. And so there's that kind of element of the movement that maybe doesn't even identify as Catholics, doesn't identify as Christians even. Maybe they the story of Christ is important to them, but a lot of other things aren't. So I think there's a lot of that in the movement, and how that will pan out for the future is unclear to me. But at the same time, there's just been generations. People when people are looking about how to live out Catholic social teaching, I think their experience is similar to mine, where they look at American history and they say, wow, like the American church is largely a history of just deep unfaithfulness to Christ and to the church's teaching. You know, you look at, I mean, going back to the beginning and the way that the U.S. bishops handled slavery, right? And were basically okay with slavery in the United States and tried to walk back, you know, what the popes were saying about it. Taken up to today, you know what I mean? There's just a lot of, I mean, the nuclear bomb, you know, the wars, the various wars that we fought across the world have largely been, you know, maybe gently discouraged by the hierarchy, but in general, like Catholics have participated in all of these sins. I mean, same with, you know, the more conservative tinged ones, you know, abortion, contraception. You don't when you think about like a real faithful witness to Christ, you can't just say, oh, look at Catholics, you know, they're out there, you know, really living it out, living a totally different way of life than most Americans. That's just not true. I mean, Catholics, there's the liberal Catholics, there's the conservative Catholics, and they believe what the liberals believe or what the conservatives believe. So I think that for those who recognize that, and that was my, you know, my experience of realizing, wow, this is you know, a real tragedy, a real wake up call to, you know, something in my life needs to be different. I look at, you know, American history, and Dorothy Day is the name that comes up as someone that was really faithfully living out the church's teaching on all sides and in all circumstances. And the movement is just, you know, has such a deep history there. So in answer to your question about, you know, is this a place of moral conversion? Like, I think that's where the tradition is alive and well. And there's a lot of other, you can point to a lot of other moments and everything of just great saints, of great moments and movements in U.S. Catholic history. But I don't think there's anything that has quite the spread and the depth as the Catholic worker movement.
And so real quick, we keep touching on Catholic social teaching, and you know, you said en masse American Catholics don't live that out. You think the reactionaries are wrong in the ways that they interpret it. How would you say? I realize this is a huge question, so whatever you can bite off, share. Like, how would you say the correct interpretation of what CST is calling for?
Yeah.
What would you say?
There's a few ways to put it. I mean, there's some slogans that different popes have put forward that are helpful when rightly understood. You know, the renewal of all things in Christ is a common one among the Piusite popes. It's JP2 like to speak of the civilization of love. And I think what those are getting at is that, I mean, one of the key teachings of Vatican II in Gaudium et Spes, as well as Apostolicam Actuositatem, which is the document on the laity. And we are the laity, right? Anyone who's not a cloistered religious or a priest or a bishop, most Christians are laity, most Catholics are laity. And that vocation is to perfect and restore the temporal order, is what the council says. And I think that in some ways could be taken as the center of what the idea of Catholic social teaching means, like why we even have a social teaching. It's to say that the gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, the things preached by Christ are not just this personal interior conversion and sanctification, redemption, but that they are also for the whole world. And that means for our personal finances, our own spending, our own possessions. It means for our whole economies. It means for our own politics, whether that's our local politics or our little church politics or, whatever, or it means for our whole, our international, our national politics. So everything, there's nothing about the temporal order, the world of earthly affairs, that does not get subordinated to the spiritual, that is not meant to experience the same radical conversion and redemption that every soul is meant to experience. So it rejects this kind of cutting off of individual, private, spiritual, internal, your soul being saved and the world being saved. And it's really what gives us the dream that has defined modernity of heaven on earth, right? All of these projects of, of liberalism, of, Marxism, of fascism, or whatever, are trying to create some kind of man-made paradise on earth. And what's important to recognize is that they get that idea from Christianity. It's Christianity that introduced the idea of the kingdom of God, which is at hand, right? It's not some distant thing. Christ says again and again, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so, that's what social teaching in all of its dimensions is about living, returning to Eden, returning to a paradise on earth in which we live out peace and justice and all these things. But the difference compared to these modern ideologies is that it's not, we don't, seek to enforce that through, through power, we have some kind of clever plan and we take over the world and then we force everyone to do this. But it's something that actually begins in our hearts. There's this easy translation between the redemption in our hearts and the redemption in the world, where our conversion is supposed to springboard into the conversion of the world. And as laity, we interact with the world. We're buying things, we're making, we have some kind of job, we're producing goods, maybe we're working for someone. We own houses, we own, transportation, we raise children, we build cities, we build roads, all of these things, all of the, everything I just mentioned, plus everything else. That's just what you consider daily life, and culture too, our music, our entertainment, whatever, is all supposed to be building up the kingdom of God. And so that's a tall order. And largely in America, we just don't believe that. We in some sense, we're all social modernists, as I think Pius XII says in one encyclical. We're heretics on that point, where we just we don't accept that the gospel can penetrate into the world like that. Or a way that we kind of try to soften the blow is to say that to basically take one of these modern ideologies and say, well, that's basically what Catholic social teaching is. Catholic social teaching really is compatible with liberalism, or it's really compatible with socialism, or it's really compatible with, as the reactionary, the traditionalists say, essentially a sort of fascism. You know what I mean? Like we'll take over the government and we'll sort of enforce Catholicism, and we'll have this kind of centralized Catholic state. In any case, it's a betrayal of that radical vision of the kingdom. So I don't know if that's not that short, but that's a few different bite-sized chunks that could be taken. So
Definitely.
So we talked to Larry Chapp a bit about this, but I'd kind of like to get your take on it too. I've been a Catholic. I was converted sometime around would be like maybe 2000. So I've been a Catholic for a while. And I honestly can't tell you I've really ever heard Catholic social teaching come from the pulpit. And
good.
So, I'm wondering how much of this like lack of translation is just the church kind of getting in its own way. I mean, I think I remember asking Larry, like, why can't the church at the top kind of almost enforce a little bit more the teaching so that the laity actually learns it? Because I think a lot of them aren't even exposed to it at all, okay, in the United States. Yeah. So, I mean, what would you basically agree with that? I mean, and given that observation, like what is your take on, just how much of it is just like the American church not doing its due diligence towards the teachings?
My wife and I were just looking at this last night, Vatican II here. In that document on the laity that I mentioned, Apostolicam Actuositatem, there's a section on the way that the laity should interact with the hierarchy, right? And it says, this is section 24, the hierarchy's duty is to favor the lay apostolate, furnish it with principles and spiritual assistance, direct the exercise of the apostolate to the common good of the church, and see to it that doctrine and order are safeguarded. So when it's talking about the lay apostolate, it means that in the broadest sense, I mean, everything I just mentioned, it's basically our whole job as laity to renew and perfect the temporal order, the world, right? So, one of the things that Vatican II says is the job of the hierarchy is to furnish it with principles, right? And that's exactly what you said, right? Like we should know the priest or the bishop, right? Their job is not to say, don't shop at Walmart, right? Their job is to say, is our purchasing, our the goods we buy, are workers being paid a just wage, right? That's a principle of the church. Are we making sure that there's, we're not participating in the throwaway culture, as Pope Francis calls it in Laudato Si, right? Are we making sure that the principle of subsidiarity, right, doing things on the more local level when possible, is that being applied in our economic activity? And then it's our job as the laity to say, oh, wait, you know what? Walmart does not line up with any of those things. If possible, I should find other ways of purchasing my goods. If I could find some other way of supplying my goods, or maybe I could create a local business that, provides produce or something to people and pays them a just wage, things like that, right? But the problem is definitely part of the problem is what you said, is that you do not hear that from the pulpit. I mean, you hear occasionally about, abortion, you know what I mean? From maybe more conservative preachers. And I think liberal preachers too will often maybe say, oh, we need to care about migrants or something, care about the poor. But even then, the way that they say it is, oh, well, that means that I should vote for a certain politician, right? That's what it's reduced to. It's not, I should, we need to, we care about, say, abortion, so we need to restore the family in the vast sort of intergenerational sense. We need to, or we care about migrants. So more than just voting for some politician, who's not going to do anything anyways, we need to specifically care for maybe the migrants in our town, in our place, or we need to stop purchasing food from exploited migrant labor, right? Those connections are not driven home at all. And so, but I think it goes both ways. Like, I don't want to be here and say, oh, if the clergy would just furnish us with the principles, as the council says, we would do it, because we know that the laity in most cases is just as prodigal as much of the clergy is on this stuff. Is that I've talked to priests who say, yeah, I would really like to preach on these things, but I don't want to push them too hard. I don't want to alienate them. I don't want them to leave the church. I got to meet them where they're at. And, it's not for me to judge any particular situation, but I think we as laity need to certainly encourage, show our willingness to be docile to the true teachings of the church and to be living them out. And then there's definitely a great courage that's needed from clergy to be willing to preach the hard gospel and the full gospel. And in the great, I love to point to John Chrysostom. He's the golden mouth, the great model of preachers, and his reward for his fierce preaching was, getting exiled by the emperor, right, and being sent to the far reaches of the empire, and then later, because he was still popular over there by people who saw him as a saint, he was sent on a forced march and died of sickness on the way. And I think maybe, something along those lines. We know in our own days, like Oscar Romero is a great example of a bishop who really lived out the social teaching of the church, and he was assassinated for it. But that's the seed of the church, right? Like that willingness to suffer. So I think, again, moral conversion, the repentance and accepting the gospel requires that on both sides. So I think that's a big part of the problem, but I don't want to say that it only begins with the clergy. It really, it begins with each of us, and hopefully it redounds as well to our clerics.
So if you'll indulge a little thought experiment, kind of riffing off that, let's say there is some sort of mass conversion of people, a revolution of the heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you discern that you have a calling to be like the presidential candidate for like the American Solidarity Party or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
And you win to great public applause, and you are sort of leading this new Catholic social teaching renaissance in America. Again, this is a huge question, but like, could you just give us some vision of like what, how people's lives would change concretely if it was this mass movement?
Well, I would want to suggest that I don't know that that idea would pan out, as you say, because there'd be a lot of steps between mass conversion and, presidential candidate winning. So for example, right, like there are, what's the population of the US? Is it 400 million at this point?
I thought it was
Something like that.
40, but I have no idea.
Someone can fact check me on that. But anyways, we're talking about, a lot of people.
Right.
Part of the way that the US works in the global economy is we are the sort of consumer center of the world. If, like China, right? Like China's economic boom and growth is deeply interlinked with ours because they make the consumer goods that we consume, and the way that capitalism works. Yeah. So 336 million people. For someone to win the presidential election, obviously, a lot of people don't vote or whatever, but, you would need millions of people who are not just converted, because there are millions of Catholics in the US, but let's just say, actually, if you want to look up the number, how many Catholics are in the United States? If you had 10,000 people, 100,000 people, multiple millions of people who were living out Catholic social teaching, one of the biggest things I think you'd see is way less consumption, right? You'd see way less people buying things they don't need, which again is like, that's central to the American economy, is that we're a consumer economy. You know what I mean? We're for the top 10% of people, right? We're going out to eat all the time. We're buying the new gadgets and gizmos. There's a reason that they're up to the iPhone. I don't actually know what they're up to, maybe 14 now or something. Right. The reason that they can keep selling those is because, there's a market for them. Those companies exist for that reason. The reason that there's a massive porn industry, the reason there's a massive television, industry, and always, new shows, the reason that new cars, there's so much gasoline's being used, that there's private jets, and even just, first class airlines going around. I mean, I could go on and list all these things. I think that if you saw millions and millions of converts, from the richest to the poorest, you would see people saying, wow, these choices to consume in this way do not reflect the gospel. I have to stop doing this. I have to start giving this money to the poor. I have to maybe start purchasing from my local community, building up institutions there. And when you start doing that, the very sinews of what makes our economy function would start to crumble. Literally sometimes when there's a part of the stimulus checks that were given out recently with the pandemic is because there's a need for consumption. Like it would have been bad for the economy if there wasn't enough consumption. And so I think that if you saw that mass conversion long before we're talking about any kind of political victories on the national scale, I think you would start to see real shifts in local communities that would start to care for each other in new ways, to start to build when we talk about that phrase, building the new society in the shell of the old. I think you would start to see that in pockets, in places where people were gathering together doing that. And things would start to look different on the, the ways that our general economy would function. And that's just on economics. That's setting aside questions like, warfare, our participation in our military system, and a lot of other questions. But so I think, I maybe feel free to reframe the question, but I think my point would be that I think that before we think, because I think in America we're so fixated on who's the president, who is the kind of the big names, but I don't think that's quite how Christianity works, in the sense that that conversion happens on the personal level and then kind of builds up from there.
Okay. Well, so let's say that stage was achieved, that you have sort of like regional, you have like micro Christendoms, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the next stage past that?
Yeah.
Like what could that look like? And I guess just what I'm trying to get at with this is I think it's so hard to imagine, because we are so liberal, that, and because we're so like embedded in the world as we've always experienced it, that we can't imagine. I mean, it's just a cliche that like it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Yeah.
To me, the value of these things is not like, here's what we're going to do, but we're just trying to break open people's imaginations to kind of see what this could or should look like.
Yeah. Well, maybe to answer that, let me give you two answers when you only asked for one. On the one hand, we can imagine Eden, right? And at the beginning of Andrew Jones's book, The Two Cities, which is from New Polity, a great book that kind of goes through, especially in the very beginning, kind of lays out maybe a vision of this. And the idea that in Eden, right, Adam and Eve, our first parents, they were not meant to, like, the fall wasn't supposed to happen, right? The fall is not a given, something that God actively wanted. Rather, if the fall hadn't happened, they would have children, and their children would have children, and there would be they would build a society, right? They would start as a family, but they would spread out. They would build villages, cities, civilizations, and that would all be part of one grand family that would all speak one language, and maybe would have their own second languages elsewhere and everything, but would be united in their faith, in their knowledge of God that would come from Adam being alive and being the high priest of that society. Adam and Eve being the mother of all, as well as the rulers of all, in a way that would, you can imagine, I sometimes like to describe it as this kind of like Edenic futurism, you know what I mean? Like a million years out into a world where the fall didn't happen. What does it look like? You've got millions of people, nobody dies, right? Death is an effect of sin. And what world do they build where there's no sin, where there's no murder, greed, envy, lust, where none of that is there? Certainly they build something because, again, that's what the church teaches. The world, we're given creation to be fruitful, to multiply, to till and keep the earth. They would certainly use technology, but the technology wouldn't be driven by fear and scarcity. It would be driven by a desire to give glory to God. So, you would probably have local food systems, as would make sense, but then maybe you would have, trains that would connect the world, and everything would be used in limited ways. When Adam and Eve discover fossil fuels and their, civilization, how do they use them? Do they use them in this profligate way where it's this drive to accumulate as much as possible? Or do they use them in this incredibly measured way, only for the glory of God? And they retain all of the sort of natural, traditional, food systems, craft skills, all this kind of thing that, that are good and don't need to be taken over by the factory system or by big agriculture or what have you. So that's maybe the vision that we should put in our minds, right? When you say, like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, I totally agree. But like the alternative, the utopian horizon that we should have is an Edenic civilization. And that should be like what, propels us in the kind of world that we want to build. With that said, what can we expect, right? Because, in the gospel, Christ promises us that in this life you will have trials, but take courage, I have overcome the world. We can expect martyrdom. We can expect persecution. Like if we're living towards that horizon, if everyone were to live towards it, we would attain it. We would live in that blissful society. But, Christ tells us to expect suffering, martyrdom, persecution. So I think that, when you ask about that next step, we should always be living towards the kingdom of God, right? Like we should always be living towards that, that Edenic utopian horizon that so many, that ultimately was taken in secular bastardizations. That's what like the Marxist utopian ideal is, right? Or what like the liberal, techno futurist vision is of, a world where technology saves us from all scarcity, right? A post-scarcity world is possible. It is real. It exists in God's kingdom, and that kingdom is already present, right? But at the same time, we know that it's not incumbent on worldly success for us to pursue that, right? Like if we pursue that post-scarcity world, if we live in that world that's free of, the death and fear that sin bring, even if we're killed, right? And we can kind of expect that we will be, perhaps. We'll be already living in that kingdom, right? And that we will ultimately arrive in that and enjoy that. So those are sort of two answers that I think hang in tension ultimately as just the essence of Christianity.
Kind of just hearing you talk about that makes me want to, I'm going to talk about my own situation here in my little backyard, like you made me see it in a different light. I've been gardening for years and I've got a lot of permaculture.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about, someday I won't live here. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuff will continue to be here. And I really thought about the fact that is one little tiny legacy that a person can leave, actually. I've just primarily thought of it as a way to feed myself. Right. Do you garden? And how do you see whether you do or you don't, how do you see that kind of fairly moderate activity in this direction? Is that worth doing or is it not enough?
Yeah. Well, I do garden, not very well, and I haven't done it for very long, only a couple of years now, since starting a Catholic worker house. And I'm learning, my lettuce has not done very well. My tomatoes are doing okay. I'm in a little urban garden situation, so I don't have much, and I've, use whatever little spaces you can find that have, sun, or you can put a little raised bed in and such. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly not, I think what you said there, the recognition that the kingdom being at hand is part of, it's not something that only happens after the revolution, right? It's something that happens in our hearts and can happen right now through conversion to Christ and relationship with him. And then it begins to spread out from there. It spreads into our relationships, in my wife and I, in our marriage, right? We obviously sin and we fail, but in general, we are living I'm deeply blessed, to be living in the peace and justice. I don't feel like there's, oppression or, violence or warfare or all these things that come with sin. In our relationship in general. And obviously it's imperfect. And that's one thing about this life that we have to endure, but same with gardening, right? In that relationship that I have with that tiny little bit of land I have in my raised beds and my pots, where I'm not trying to hound the soil for some sort of maximum yield, regardless of, what kind of petrochemicals I'm using or, my goal in that is not profits, right? My goal in that is to feed myself and others, you know what I mean? And in that relationship that I have with the land, with those specific plants, the kingdom of God is present. And I can imagine how that would then expand, imagine if that's how every person who owned land used their land. Imagine if that's how every farmer used their land. Imagine if that's, what our local markets were all about, instead of, profit and accumulation, if they were about feeding people, if they were about, God's glory and this right relationship, with the abundance of God's earth. So I totally agree. And I think it's important, I definitely, the Doughertys over at New Polity speak a lot on this, that it's part of our universal and original vocation to till and keep the land, no matter who we are. We might have our different vocations to other kinds of work, but it's wrong of us to totally off-put our duty to be in relationship with the earth onto other people. That kind of having that foothold, even if it's small, you know what I mean? Not all of us are called to cultivate acres and acres or to have a whole herd of cows or something like that. But to have a real relationship with the way that God feeds us through the abundance of creation, that transforms our hearts. Like that really changes us as well as the land we're in relationship with. And it's part of how we lift up creation, which does not have an intellectual, irrational soul. Humans are the bridge between the material and the divine. And so that's how we lift up the world and engage in that apostolate.
And have you ever, is part of your discernment with your future of the Catholic worker movement, like, are you thinking about maybe going to a farm, or is that ruled out, or where do you stand on, I guess, the rural urban divide? Yeah,
it's a great question. One thing is that the suburbs aren't doing too much. You know what I mean? Yeah, they gotta. And in some ways, there's a place for the urban and the rural both, because, the cities have a real role, right? In being centers of commerce, of law, cathedrals, right? The order of the church kind of flows from the cathedral, the city church. But of course, the land is, hard to come by in a city. And that's compounded in our sort of speculative economy through the housing market and the way that disrupts everything. I think for us, two conflicting, my wife and I, two conflicting discernments is, on the one hand, walking to church has always been really important to us. I've seen the way that, I've worked with the Amish before, and your church is an actual like physical limit, and they don't have church buildings, but they go around different houses. But like the church district is a real unit. They have villages in Essentia, or, a parish unit, and they're not big. They're maybe 3 miles from end to end, at least around here. Like that would be on the upper size. Some are smaller. And that really changes what church community looks like when you live near the people that you worship with. And we as Catholics who have, given ourselves over to church shopping, going to the liturgy that personally suits us most, and driving there, sometimes even, this is something that traditionalists are particularly guilty of, driving, 40 minutes, an hour, to a church, means that you do not live anywhere in the proximity of your church community. And that has crippling effects on what the village is supposed to be. And like the village is the next level up from the family. Groups of families are supposed to come together in villages, whether that's sort of the urban village of a little neighborhood, or it's the rural village of a little, traditional agricultural village. I think, when you asked earlier about like, what restoring a Catholic society looks like, or really just the conversion of people to Christ and to that right relationship, I think that's the next level, long before one touches anything about the national level. How do we restore those local communities? And I think that proximity to church is a really key part of that. That said, how do you balance that with, because of the way our housing and land market works, it's very hard to get any parcel of land, much less one that's near church. So that's something we've struggled with, and we're blessed. We have a beautiful parish, a very old, beautiful parish that we live. I'm a 3-minute walk from my church. And that's an immense blessing on so many levels. We do know some parishioners who have land who are pretty close. They still generally drive. It's a bikeable distance. You could walk it, but it would take maybe an hour with some of them. But that's not totally undoable. So Lancaster is a smaller city, like 60,000 people. It's kind of the upper limits of how big a city can get, before it becomes kind of hyper industrialized, beyond the limits of a good city. So that's, again, a long-winded answer to your question, just of those are different poles of discernment. I think for different people, that's going to look different for their own circumstances. But I think the goal is definitely to have that, that real relationship with the land. Chesterton's favors 3 acres and a cow, is, I think, for the average person, really should be a sort of model. And especially if we're going to feed ourselves after the collapse of our industrial food systems. Chris Smage has written excellently about this. Like we need to return to that kind of small farm way of life.
Yeah, I checked out Smage. Thank you for that reference.
Yeah,
His
he's great.
books look really, really good, and that's maybe somebody we might want to have on this podcast too at some point.
Certainly. His new book is coming out, so that would be good to, I'm sure he's doing the rounds talking about that. And I've gone back and forth. Smage is not Catholic himself, but is, I say that he's, like the best distributist author of our generation. And his book, A Small Farm Future, is really excellent. So
okay. Well, we'll look more into him. My fiance really wanted me to ask you about kind of the intersection between trying to be in the Catholic worker movement and the discipline necessary to have a family. Because I think she views these things as there's a lot of potential tension there, especially if you're part of a Catholic worker that like really values, like Franciscan humility.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, could you speak to that situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that, we'll have to continue talking about it because it's something we're still, discerning and learning. I mean, we were, of course, married for the 2 years that we were in a Catholic worker. And there's definitely those sorts of family community conflicts. How much privacy can a family rightly ask for? How much do the duties of a family, pull away, or, those sorts of questions. It also, when you have other members who are single, it puts you in a different relationship with them because then you're kind of like a unit as opposed to them being individual members. So it definitely, it has its difficulties. There's a lot of models of families that have run Catholic workers. The Cornells, Tom and Monica Cornell, we knew, they raised their kids, sort of in a Catholic worker context at Guadalupe House in Connecticut. And there's other examples, out there. But I do know the stories. I mean, I know of one family that when they had started having kids, they really dialed back their hospitality, and they still like did food, but they didn't have like people over, like, sleeping over and long-term guests as much, just because of difficulties with boundaries with children and those sorts of things. So, it has its difficulties. At the same time, like, I don't want, there's examples of other families who have a Christ room and they have make a room set aside in their house, and they do have long-term guests there and stuff. So that hospitality is definitely possible, but it takes discernment. And I think for ourselves, we're really interested in what can, because I think in many ways, like, Catholic worker life is an expression, like those principles is really just, the church's social teaching, right? Like there's the particular way, there's Catholic worker farm communes, there's the big houses of hospitality, but the key principles is not, you have to join one of those two. The key principles is, you have to live out that conversion through the church's social teaching and through putting that into practice, what the Sermon on the Mount means for your life. And I think families are particularly poised and called to do that. So I think for us, a big question is, how do we kind of live that out more intently? And right now we're discerning it a lot, thinking in terms of, there's a lot of like third orders, if you're familiar with like, the secular Franciscans and such, that are in some ways, like there's a similar kind of call there, but it's often not very, radically expressed. I think some of the best examples are among Anabaptists. You see a lot of, the Amish, of course, they're not living out hospitality and some of those other values that are really important, but the way that they have very intentional communal limits on technology, on what church membership means and that full commitment. I think there's definitely a lot of models out there that as Catholics, is really important to be looking towards, to be discerning. And maybe just as a general note on that point, this isn't an answer to that question. It's kind of just the prompt to that question that, you and I are probably both discerning very heavily is the way that conversion happens in the church generally is through new things happening, through the Spirit working in people. St. Francis came to a time when there was a lot of sort of bloated monasteries that weren't living out poverty and was called to a new thing. And like when he started the Third Order of St. Francis, that was new. Like it was not really a thing for the laity to have that to take those sorts of vows, and especially on some of the points where they were like abstaining from oaths, abstaining from, the sword and such. And so I think that, for conversion to happen in our country, in the church, in the world, we have to be open to those new things and just spend a lot of time in prayer and discernment and see where the Spirit is leading us. So
I know one thing I wanted to ask you about was something that you mentioned way back at the beginning, which was that you were I think you said that you were in some sort of intentional community which dissolved recently.
Yeah. Well, that was Holy Family Catholic Worker. It was our, the Catholic Worker community.
Okay. Could you just maybe address why did it?
Sure. Yeah. And actually, before I do that, let me just go back to your point briefly, just a recommendation. My friend Malcolm Schlunderfritz, he has a podcast. It's not really running new episodes, but has a backlog of great ones. Happy Are You Poor, it's called, after the Thomas Dubay book. And he's interviewed a lot of people of many different intentional communities. So I would just recommend it as a place for a lot of, what I was just saying about those new things that are happening in the church. That's just hearing those testimonies has been a really great inspiration. To your question, it was kind of a mix of things. We had several things happen at once where we had two houses at that point. One, the house I'm in right now that my wife and I got a mortgage on because we needed to expand space. So we bought a neighboring house. And we were very blessed to be able to do that. We were renting the initial house that we started in. The landlord wanted to sell it, so evicted us from that original house. So that was one big stressor of like we had, everyone trying to cram into one house and figure out, what was coming next. And we did not really have the space there. We had people sleeping on the couch in the living room and all sorts of stuff. And then, so that was one thing. We also had just had our son, Thomas. So that was another big change for us. And then on top of all that, some other members of the community discerned that they had to leave just due to family things and stuff going on in their life. So I think it was just that mix of things all at once that it put the question of our mind of like, if we're going to move forward, how do we do it? And we were thinking about maybe we need to fundraise for another house, or look at these different things. But we prayed about it. We took some time and some retreats and everything. And the Lord actually really gave us a lot of peace, my wife and I, in realizing that it was time to dissolve that community. So, I'm very blessed in receiving that grace, because I think that if we hadn't, I think it could have been a really like disheartening or stressful or even just kind of traumatic experience for us. But I think, we just recognized that this is where what God was giving us in that moment. So it's funny, 2 years is about the average time most intentional communities last. We've kind of hit dead average in that way. And we are still really interested in community. I mean, we expect and hope and pray that we will be in another community again. And we're just taking this time now, though, to discern what that's going to look like and what our own calling is, and whether whatever comes next is in the Lord's hands. But we're very grateful for all that experience gave us.
I think it's worth continuing to experiment and trying new ways. I mean, it does seem like people, especially conditioned by our current culture, find it really, really hard to closely communicate and or live directly in the same domicile. And it may just be like too much for a lot of people to deal with, but there's probably a lot of gradations and arrangements that people could come up with. For instance, maybe just living in the same area and coming up with ways to cooperate. It just may be a bit much. I mean, basically, strong community is almost asking people to become like Franciscan monks or something like that. And there's a reason why we have monks and why we have non-monks, I suppose. And and maybe that's some wisdom there maybe that's part of the peace that you feel, is that, this is kind of dealing with our reality, right?
Well, I think one thing that's been on our minds a lot, very much what you just said, is like realizing There's different communities that do it a different way, and I encourage anyone who is inspired and feels called to start something, like, you can't go wrong in just trying it. I mean, obviously, pray about it, discern it. Don't think that everything's just going to work on the strength of your own will, because it won't. But don't allow the fears of what will go wrong. Like, if it goes wrong, that's okay. Maybe God wants you to learn through a community that only lasts a year, or something like that. And that can be a great formative experience that can then lead to stronger community or stronger, apostolate work, living out the gospel in the future. And to your point, I think one thing, at least on our minds, and can't say this is for everyone and for all Catholic workers, but especially for us as a family that's, seeking to raise children. I think that idea of that combination of sort of third order life and community is really important. Like, when we started the community, there was rules and everything, but it wasn't like there wasn't as strict, like a sort of a rule in the sense of a third order rule. And I think that's something that we're really interested in, and we feel a draw to commit ourselves to, is the kind of community life. And there are communities out there that do this, of lay people, who have children. I mean, the Bruderhof, they're not Catholic, but they're a great example of this, of like a truly monastic life, where there's, commitments to common prayer, to common meetings, to common labor, to work. I mean, they're a common purse community, so they don't even have private property. And they make that work. And there's other examples, that have, there's different gradations, having a common purse is maybe the most extreme level, but even having, like, I know of others that have sort of community, you pay a certain amount into the community, or others just where you have to make a vowed commitment to, like, I'm going to join in community prayer, for however often and such. And so yeah, there's so many possibilities. And I think just being open to that and recognizing that our current way of life is not converted. It's a heathen, pagan way of life, and that we need that conversion, and being open to whatever that means. Yeah.
So if you could go back in time 2 years, knowing what you know now about how that community worked out, is there anything that you personally would have done differently?
Honestly, I think the only thing would be, I've learned a lot about how to communicate with others. I mean, that's a big part of it. Like you said, it's hard. We're not used to those sorts of arrangements, where often we just get to, our lives are so separated. You've got, work, you've got family, you've got entertainment, and you don't have to, you can kind of retreat to your apartment, and even in college, that's kind of the setup in a lot of ways. That people are raised in. So I think, yeah, we don't know how to communicate in that sort of integrated life well. And certainly that's true of me. And there's plenty of ways, I look back on and say, oh, this was bad communication. This was me, being arrogant or whatever. So I think there's faults of my own that I would look back on and say, oh, these are things I've learned how to do better. But I don't think I would have changed, what we did. I don't think that we as a community where we were at were ready for, like the kind of vowed, third order life that my wife and I are now really interested in. But yeah, I think it was a great blessing, and really glad for that experience.
And I guess the final question that comes to my mind is, can you talk a little bit about New Polity in general and your involvement in it, and what you hope will come out of it?
Yeah. Well, definitely. I think I've been really blessed to be involved with New Polity. In many ways, it's it's similar to what I was trying to do with Tradistae. It's this combination of orthodoxy and radicalism. It's kind of in the vein of that communio theology that is really intent on ressourcement, on returning to the sources, but also to a real question of how to apply them in that radical way, like what I was describing earlier, the way the kingdom is supposed to reach into all parts of our life. I mean, they've done great work. There's a great Good Money series that on their podcast, and they publish various articles in that vein. that I'm a big, I always love to recommend that to people. Of just, I think it's a beginning to how we think about the way we use money. That isn't just saying, oh, don't, you need to immediately, give up all your money and join a common purse community or whatever, because, people, I don't think everyone's called to this moment. And also people easily just shut that off and say, oh, well, I'm a layperson, that doesn't apply to me. But realizing that, no, there's actually this really rich teaching. Mark Barnes and Jacob Imam have written, done great stuff on that. So yeah, on all fronts, they've got great resources on, economics, on politics, on culture, on gender, which really breaks out of this like conservative progressive divide as people talk about transgenderism and such. So, I just highly recommend people check out their stuff. I've written several articles there on different topics. And they have a conference as well once a year in Steubenville, not associated with the university, but in the actual city. That's, I just went to, it was in early May, I believe, and it's a fantastic conference. So very glad to meet anyone there. I hope to go each year. They do that. And yeah, I don't know if you have any specific questions, but in general, they're kind of, they're a place that I contribute to most, and I think are really I want to say like the cutting edge of a lot of the application of these principles that one would hope we would be getting, from the pulpit and then applying in our local communities. And sadly, that's not really the case. But yeah, they really have done great work, and they have a magazine as well. That's another key element that comes out 4 times a year. So
that's true. And then is there a lot of are they open to Catholic worker stuff, or are those two things fairly divorced at this point? Or
I don't think they come from a Catholic worker. They're not Catholic workers themselves. Dr. Jones, Mark, Jacob, that's not how they came to the social teaching and such. There's a lot of overlap because they've published various Catholic workers, myself, of course, Colin from the Twin Cities House, Malcolm, Catholic worker kind of guy. So there's a lot of I think overlap there. And when I was at the conference in May, I met a bunch of people who were, one couple I met was on their way to visit Dr. Larry Chapp. They were coming from further out west, going to the conference in Steubenville, and then going to his farm. So there's a lot of, the people who are going to be interested in their stuff are often going to be interested in the Catholic worker. And I'd like to see, that connection continue, certainly. So.
Well, we usually ask this question at the beginning of the podcast, but I forgot to, and I think it's probably a good concluding thing. So we've named the podcast this because we view modernity and liberalism and capitalism as this like giant dust bowl generating force. And we basically invite people's diatribes for like, what's the core of what's wrong with modern society and what we should do to rise to the occasion. And that's been implicit in all this, but like, do you have an explicit diatribe you would submit for what's wrong and what we should do about it? Sure,
yeah. I listened to some of your other podcasts, so I was interested in hearing some of them. I'm glad you asked the question. I think I'm not, too inclined to, I try to avoid diatribes when I can, but since I'm invited, I would say that one of the key, I think that all of the different modes of analysis that we have about capitalism or about modernity broadly often have an important grain of truth, right? There's the Marxist analysis of capitalism there and how everything is commodified. There's the, the critique of the nation state and the centralization of bureaucracy and power. And there's lots of truth to that. There's the critique of Enlightenment ideas and of radical individualist freedom. There's the ecological critique in the way that we use fossil fuels and non-renewable energies. And all of them interlock with each other, are related to each other. And I could list several more. However, I think that implicit in all of those questions is a theological question. and I always try to bring this up when I'm talking with secular-minded critics of modernity, is to point out, all of these ideas that you're critiquing. Yes, that's one mode of critique, but does it capture everything? Does it fully express things? And this is something that Marxists struggle with all the time, because they want to reduce everything to class, and they have to admit, oh well, there's also the centralization, the bureaucracy question. Things weren't the best in the Soviet Union. There's also the race question and these other things. And that goes for every critique. You talk to a conservative and they want to focus on the intellectual side of the intellectual history and the things that have gone wrong with individualism. But then you have to point to all of these material analyses. And so the one thing that I believe is that at the center, of all my sort of thinking, is that Jesus Christ is Lord. And so if that's the case, if God is real, if God created, the central gospel message that is good news, right? That God created the world good. He meant it to be good, that man fell, that he redeemed it through his only begotten son, through his life, death, and resurrection, that he rose again, and that he has given us the church and his kingdom, which are really existing in history, in the world. That's central to my belief. And that's as much central. You'll find that, a Marxist has equal faith, right, in dialectical materialism, right? Like that's their theological claim. And that's true of any secular critique, is that there is this theological claim at the center. So I think we have to actually look at history and look at, the question of these claims, how much weight do they really have? And if it's true that Jesus is God, if he is who he says he is, if it's true that we have this revelation of the Genesis story of the way the world was meant to be and how the fall happened, then the real uniting factor, the real uniting problem in the Dustbowl of modernity is sin, is this rejection of God. And not just on a personal level, of course, right? It's on a social level. All of these social forces that I just mentioned, capitalism, liberalism, racism, nationalism, are all structures of sin. And they all have their origin in the wickedness of the human heart. And that can only be healed through conversion, through that moral conversion, that faith in Jesus Christ, that hope for the kingdom, that love for God and for our neighbor, that we begin to live out, and that builds new social structures as a result, which is the kingdom at hand, the kingdom dwelling here on earth. So I think that choice that we have between God and idols, between the supreme truth, beauty, goodness, and between man-made attempts and imitations of that God-given creation, is the central question. So I think that captures all of the analyses that we have, but it also makes the question a little more pointed, because it's so easy to analyze all these things. But what people don't like to do is to, be still and have that encounter with God amid all of these swirling forces, because in all the swirling sins of modernity, we can always find sinners and point them out and say, oh, look, good thing that I'm not a great sinner like that person over there. And we make ourselves, the Pharisee, instead of having that humble prayer of recognizing, no, I am complicit in all of this. I am a sinner, and I need to repent and live out an alternative society, a new world in the shell of the old, in my own heart, in my own soul, through the grace of Jesus Christ.
Cool. Well, thank you for coming on and talking to us today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure. And look forward to being in touch.